One crash, one lollipop, one promise. The memory lived in two versions: the blurred hot metal nightmare where everything smelled of gasoline and wet cotton, and the small, absurdly ordinary object that fixed it, an orange lollipop, sticky at the edges, its wrapper torn, the girl who held it trembling like a candle in a storm. Evan Wen could not remember her name. He could remember the smell-fectant, the metallic taste of iron that filled his mouth, and the way her voice, soft, certain, had said, "I will marry you when we're grown." He had laughed at it then, delirious with pain, and the words had stuck to the inside of his chest like a promise sutured in. He woke. He lived. He learned to live with the idea that he owed everything to somebody he had never found. 3 years later, Evan Wen ruled panels and markets in a penthouse the size of a small country. He listened to quarterly reports and the low hum of servers and the polite lies of people who called him sir. He had the kind of loneliness money could not buy: a ledger of favors, a calendar of obligations, and a private room where the lights stayed dim so the city's ache could not keep him awake. He also had a file, a list of hospitals, blood donors, anyone who had the rare combination of courage and time to hand him a transfusion on a rain-dark night. For 3 years he had asked quietly, paid quietly, maneuvered quietly. None of it filled the particular void left by the image of a small, stubborn hand holding a candy. Felicia Gu's life had none of that quiet. She moved through the city in bursts, an orb of fluorescent jacket, a wheeling basket of takeout, the squeal of brakes and the beep of scooters. Her days were counted not in appointments, but in addresses delivered. Narrow stairwells, elevators that smelled like old rice, doorways where people took her for granted until their orders were cold. She kept a lollipop in her jacket pocket, partly because it reminded her of nothing and everything, partly because it was a small thing she could afford and call hers. The Gu family had once carried a name that opened doors. That was before debts, before a scandal that removed their tablecloth from the dining room of the city's respectable. They still had pride, they just had less to go around. Felicia had been shut out of the family home after a fight that was less about money than temper, a splitting of allegiances. In the neighborhood, she was that girl, the one who gave wrong change, forgot to smile, or cursed out a client for calling her inferior. People polished their contempt like a hobby. She had learned to walk fast so the world could not keep up. On a weekday that performed like any other, the rain began as a whisper.
Felicia had 3 deliveries on the North Strip, a route that wound past storefronts and through the city's petty kingdoms. Jang Motors with its gleaming show floor, the Shen boutique where brides tried on dreams, the black windows of the Chen investment firm. She put on her helmet, adjusted the lollipop in her pocket for comfort, and set off. Evan Wen, meanwhile, did not spend that morning at a shareholders' meeting. He spent it in a glassed office with a clear line of sight to the city, watching, scanning, doing that thing powerful men do when they give orders through a dozen degrees of separation. His chair faced out. The skyline turned his suppers into a gallery of lights. He was in the middle of a plan when the emergency call came. A delivery scooter had collided with a sedan in front of Jang Motors. There was shouting. Someone, no one, knew why it mattered. Evan knew because his security inbox pinged, and urgency was a scent he could read. By the time he arrived, the air had the odd metallic clarity of aftermath. People were gathered. Cameras from bloggers' phones made a field of light in the rain. The sedan's front was crumpled like a rose pressed under a book. A woman in a fluorescent jacket crouched beside the driver, hands red with blood. Her sleeve was smeared, the lollipop wrapper stuck to her knuckles. Evan watched from the rim of the cordon. Something in the way she moved, the back straight yet raw, a kind of defiant softness, pulled at a string that had been knitting in his chest for years. He stepped forward before he could advise himself otherwise. She looked up. The rain made her lashes into a wet fan. Their eyes met, and for a second neither recognized a face so much as a knot of memory. The orange color, the small scar above the eyebrow, the stubborn tilt of mouth. He heard, very clearly, his own promise whispering back through the years. Stay. The word left his mouth with the quiet authority of a man used to people obeying instructions. It was absurd, because authority had nothing to do with the way she had once held a candy and bled for a stranger. But authority had teeth, and it could bite back the crowd that always wanted to diagnose and discard. Felicia blinked. She had been preparing to run. After all, who wanted to stick around when the wealthy descended like vultures to sort blame for a dent and bumper? But the voice, low, steady, threaded with a familiarity like an old cord, made her remain. When he knelt to the driver, the blood that stained the seat was not his own. That was another miracle. But one old debt unspooled in Evan's chest. He owed someone for a blood bag and a bandage and a lollipop promise. Standing here, He felt the past fold into the present like two pages pressed together. The driver would be all right. The sedan's owner, a junior manager from one of Evan's partner companies, swore loudly that he would sue whoever slowed down his life. People clustered into camps, sides to cheer, testimonies to be filed into gossip channels. Roy Chen emerged from the crowd like a bad smell, his smile varnished by ambition, his hand already reaching for a headline. Felicia bristled. Roy was a familiar pain. The ex-husband, the one who still bled into her life like a splinter. He had married her once when she was younger, a transaction of affection and debt. He had promised shelter, she had promised obedience. It had lasted short enough to cause scandal and long enough to leave bruises on memory. Roy's family, the Chen Mame, had not forgiven Felicia for leaving the arrangement when it suited her conscience better than comfort. He was the kind of man who kept a ledger of insults and paid them back with interest. "Look at her," Roy said loudly, the way small men make their words into knives. "She's the one who caused the pileup. Just look at her. If she hadn't been weaving through traffic—" Enough. Evan's voice was quiet in the rain, but it landed. The crowd turned like a weather front. He had authority, and he used it. She's not the problem. That was the first public defense. It did not sound heroic. It sounded like practical containment. But around them, the city swallowed it and stored it as gossip's first course. Felicia felt the keen edge of being watched. Her delivery bag slapped against her hip, the lollipop wrapper crinkled in her fist. The driver, shaken and swearing, sat propped against the curb. His breaths punctuated the rain. Felicia's hands were steady because she had learned steadiness as a trade. She had once given blood like someone offers a truth. Back then, she had no idea the man in the hospital bed would grow into the face in the penthouse who now cut through the crowd as if he owned the air. "You okay?" Evan asked the driver. The question was simple. The man nodded. That should have been the end. But narratives never stop. The cameras had smelled conflict, and like carrion birds came closer. Bloggers flicked their screens, whisperers in dresses adjusted their hair, and a woman in a pearl necklace took a live stream with the kind of delighted malice that survives on others' small catastrophes. Someone called for a name. Roy pushed forward to bawl it into a microphone. The scene tightened. The city's appetite for scandal was an endless trench. Felicia hated attention. She hated the way rich people's faces softened in relief when there was a spectacle to distract them from their own complicated consciences. She hated, most of all, very little on its surface, but fit in instinct. When he reached out and touched the small bandage at her temple, no more than a quarter-inch of scar tissue, he felt the past stitched through wood and bone. "You gave blood," he said, almost to himself. Felicia blinked. "What?" "You gave blood to someone, years ago." His voice had the thick softness of someone who keeps treasures in a safe place. He was not asking for credit or for a favor. He was naming a debt that had been folding him into a maze. The crowd hummed as if it had been waiting for this cue. Headlines were already forming. CEO steps in for delivery girl, delivery driver responsible for downtown crash, blood, lollipop, and a promise. Roy moved his lips into the shape of profit. Felicia felt the memory rise like bile. She had given blood 3 years prior, at a community drive she had pedaled to after too many late shifts. She had not been thinking of promises. She had been thinking of rent and of getting home before the streetlights blinked out. She remembered, faintly, a hand closing over hers with a weak grip in a hospital that smelled like antiseptic and the taste of copper. She remembered a man's breath like a tide. But that the hospital man would become a man who could carve the city into districts of allegiance, that threw her into an odd silence. "That was you," Evan said softly, as if he were closing a circle. The cameras tilted toward them, and the world pressed its ear to the seam. The first press note landed, "Who is she?" and the answer would ricochet through tabloids and gossip feeds for weeks. Felicia felt the air crackle with possibilities that were not good ones. The rich love origin stories the way predators love prey, to tame, to file, to remake. Roy smiled like a man with a script. "So this is her," he announced, lower than tact. He moved his phone closer. "Felicia Gu, former wife, current rogue. Did you know the Wen Corporation supports reckless people like this?" He launched the charge casually, like catapulting words. Evan's jaw tightened. Deflection was a useful skill. She was not reckless. She was helping someone. "Helping?" Roy scoffed.
She causes trouble wherever she goes. My client could have had his car ruined. Who pays for that? Does Evan Wen pay for the mess she leaves? There it was, the attempt to convert a human moment into a balance sheet. The crowd lapped it up. Felicia's face twitched into a grimace. She did not want to be objectified into a cautionary tale. Her life was not a parable to be used at dinner parties. Evan stepped forward. "She will not be used for your headlines," he said. The phrase was small and sharp. It was not charity, it was not pity. It was a shield, and shields cost money only when the person behind them wishes them to. That evening, social media split neatly into hashtags. Some called her a hero, others a nuisance. The image of the lollipop popped up with a dozen captions. Orange candy, symbol of fate.
The city loved to turn a private thing public, and it did so with the brisk efficiency of people who had lost the ability to surprise themselves. Felicia returned to her route, the reins still a fine, precise curtain. She was shaken but steady in movement. She had little time to dwell on recognition. Orders were waiting. Bills were waiting. Pride, far from being a thing you could afford in her position, was a hazardous commodity. Across the city, in the quiet of his offices lined with glass, Evan gripped the edge of his desk until the knuckles blanched. He had found her, a skinnier, wearier version perhaps of the girl who had held a candy outside a hospital 3 years ago, but found nonetheless. He had the vague sense that fate likes to laugh and then listen. He also had something else, an unfamiliar ache that felt dangerously like a wanting to protect. The decision that night was practical in its first shape. Felicia would not be left in the press's teeth to be chewed. She had shown courage, and he had the means to transform courage into safety. He arranged a ride, one of his drivers, a clean car, and a polite driver who would not pry. He arranged two for a doctor friend to check on the driver who had been in the sedan. He did not arrange a fanfare. He preferred his gestures clipped and efficient. That was how he liked favors to be returned, useful and with receipts. Yet each small protective act knit him closer to the memory of a night that smelled like disinfectant and a boy's breath losing its strength. Felicia was suspicious of help. She had been taught to distrust hands that financed good intentions, because such hands often required collateral. She kept her guard up, practiced smiles on a loop, and accepted Evan's ride with the kind of nonchalance that had served her when men tried compliments like thin veils. The driver who took her home was polite, and did not look at her with the mixture of pity and curiosity she despised. He asked no questions. He simply dropped her at the edge of the neighborhood, where the streetlights made the puddles into constellations. He took a fare and left. Felicia climbed the narrow stairs to a tiny apartment, and for the first time that day, let the silence close around her. At dawn, she was back at her scooter. Life had no sympathy for revelations. People waited hungry for their lunches, and the city functioned on a religion of punctuality. Someone called her name in the market, one of the few people who tolerated her at the stalls, and handed her a packet of scallion pancakes like an offering. She accepted, partly because she was hungry, and partly because kindness sometimes arrived free. Evan, by contrast, called a meeting. He did not tell his board about the lollipop. He told them about contingency plans and personnel adjustments, phrases that hid tenderness in the clothes of corporate governance. He sent a security detail to keep watch on Felicia, an action he described on paper as protective observation. To himself, it felt like a debt finally put into motion. News spread, as news does, in spirals that snap and travel. The Zhang family, whose showroom had served as the backdrop to the crash, sent a curt letter of complaint. The Shen boutique smelled of perfume and thinly veiled sneers. Mandy Shen, always in pale silk, adjusted her hair as if the world were a stage and she had been cast as its principal. The Chen family, wings outstretched, grinned in expectation. Roy began dropping hints into the right ears, weaving a narrative of Felicia as a manipulative figure who used tragedy to leverage her position. They moved like a pack, Zhang and Shen and Chen, because elites do not so much conspire as echo each other. They had a social code. When one rose to dishonor, the rest must follow with indignation and a ledger entry. They preferred to flatten oddities to maintain the pattern of propriety. Felicia's first humiliation came precisely where the elites love to strike: ritual. There was an engagement banquet at the Shen household that had been months in planning, a wheeled universe of porcelain and polite anger. Evan, quiet but determined, chose to attend. He would not arrive as patron, he would arrive as witness.
That in itself was a provocative gesture. The banquet was the city's way of saying who belonged and who did not. At the banquet, the table glittered with silver and eyes that measured transactions. Elders sat like judges. Cameras, professional this time, moved in like flies. There was a ritual for everything: who sat where, who poured tea, who accepted bows. Felicia arrived as a rumor on 2 feet, escorted because Evan insisted on ensuring she would not be lonely in a field of predators. They placed her at the periphery. She was given a seat that had been intended for a sponsoring family's minor cousin, an insult wrapped in protocol. The room hummed with small, cultured gasps. Mandy Shen's smile was a blade disguised as lace. "You must be the woman they say saved him," Mandy said from the other side of the table. Her voice was honey, but the taste was vinegar. "How brave." Felicia accepted the words with a tight smile. She had been surviving on tight smiles for years. "I did what anyone would if they could," she said. It was the honest kind of lie people use to keep themselves modest in a room that measures worth by spectacle. Mandy leaned in as if she were offering counsel. "You understand our customs here, don't you?" she asked. The question was not about knowledge, it was a warning. "We have a way of honoring acts like that, with dowry, with gifts, with appropriate acknowledgments. It would be a shame if misunderstandings persisted." Felicia heard the implication. The elites believed in the power of appearances. Offerings were not generosity so much as declarations of social order.
She smiled through it, because the alternative was to dismantle the room by anger, a strategy both messy and expensive. Roy, who had insinuated himself through the crowd, gestured as if the banquet were his stage. He called for a toast in a voice that cut like cheap glass. "To clarity," he said. The toast shifted the conversation. The banquet became a court of opinion, and Felicia found 100 historically useful ways to be embarrassed. Someone, always a someone in rooms like that, pulled a trick, a subtle accusation, a suggestion that Felicia had taken more than she should, that she had a way of attracting pity that manipulated pity into profit. The room tittered. Elders exchanged looks. An uncle from a proud branch of the Shen family cleared his throat and asked if she had presented proof of her past charity. It was petty and cruel, and it landed. Evan watched from the table like a man watching a tidal wave approach a beach. He had already resolved not to flinch at public opinion. His presence was a measure of support. When Roy suggested, loudly and with the casual cruelty of a man angling for a gain, that Felicia had manipulated the story for personal gain, Evan rose. "You will not humiliate her," he said plainly, a sentence that silenced more than it declared. In the hush, the room recalibrated. Some applauded in a polite way, others scowled. To defend someone of lower status at a table assembled to praise propriety was to break a covenant. It won allies and enemies in equal measure. Felicia felt the taste of bile rise. The air in the residence vibrated with polite outrage. She had expected ruin. She had not expected a man to plant himself between her and ruin like a fortress wall. After the banquet, callers rang with opinions. The city's social channels analyzed the night as if it had been a chess move. "The Wen man defends the delivery girl. Bravo," read one headline. "Was it love or leverage?" asked another. The narrative began to split along predictable lines. Was Evan protecting her because debt bound him, or because something more tender grew in the cracks of obligation? Felicia refused to allow herself to breathe in the rhetoric. She cleaned her scooter the next morning with scrubbing brushes she kept for utensils, because pride was a useful ritual. She patched her jacket where the seam threatened to give. She kept the lollipop in her pocket like a talisman and a joke. If the elites were plotting humiliation, they were not subtle about the tools they preferred. Invitations to the shadow banquet, the city's true center of power, began to circulate in the way butterflies carry seeds, lightly, on the wind, fragile and capable of planting ruin. The Shadow Consortium, chaired by an inscrutable figure known to the city as Lady Shadow, had the power to freeze or melt empires with a statement. Invitations carried weight unlike social niceties. Under Lady Shadow's light, reputations crystallized or dissipated.
Felicia received mention in those talks as a flaw to be filed away. Roy whispered algorithms of ruin. He suggested that if a man like Evan could be persuaded she was tainted, then his favor could be auctioned. The elites smiled like those arranging sculptures. They knew to chip where it hurt. Evan, who had been through the particular cold of his search and the warmer confusion of recognition, grew more deliberate. He did not court publicity. He used resources to build a net. He quietly lent his power to slow the tidal gossip. He sent careful words to the press. He asked Lady Shadow's influence to be discreet. He asked his legal team to prepare letters that smelled of contractual courtesy. Yet these were small measures in a city of grandees. Felicia, for her part, did the dangerous thing she did best. She continued to live. She picked up orders, she delivered, she received stares that tried to compress her into a story. She found in the small hours a line of resilience that had nothing to do with status. She could face a room full of people prepared to pillory her and survive. That was not indifference, it was a form of armor. When the first formal attack came, it was procedural and precise. Roy, using a match of rumor and influence, set up a hearing. Nothing official, just a social tribunal where the Shen and Zhang would sit in judgment and the Chen family would provide background noise. The aim was to kneel her in public, make her bow as symbolic retribution. In a culture that revered ritual, kneeling was humiliation dressed as repentance. Evan intercepted the writs with the clean authority of someone who could move an entire committee the way other people move pieces on a chessboard. He demanded that any such tribunal be postponed until facts were checked. He demanded that the banquet's honor rituals not be used to turn a human being into a cautionary tale. The elites bristled. They were used to being obeyed by those lower on the ladder. That night, Felicia lay awake in her small apartment, the lollipop stick peeking from her pocket like a confession. She thought of the hospital lights and a boy's hand that had been too weak to hold on. She thought of the old promise, "Marry me when we're grown." She laughed softly at herself. It was absurd, that promise, and yet it had threaded itself into the architecture of a life she had not chosen. Stay with us till the end to see how a single act of courage toppled an empire of pride, a voice, soft, editorial, might say in another form. Life, however, did not ask for promises. It demanded endurance. The city shifted in its sleep. The elites sharpened their plans, and in a small apartment across town, a delivery girl held tight to the wrapper of a lollipop and wondered what it meant to be owed a life. The next morning, Roy made his first recorded move, a private meeting with a group of investors whose patience was thin and whose ire at Evan's interference was thinly veiled.
He argued that Felicia's presence next to Evan undermined steady governance. He spun tales of impropriety and manipulation. The Zhang heir, Zeke, smirked at the edges, young, slick, with a habit of treating human beings as leverage. Mandy Shen polished the narrative until it gleamed enough to be attractive to fortune-hungry allies. Lady Shadow, who rarely spoke without calculating the consequences of breath, watched the ripples through proxies. Her name was a lever in the city. When she favored a person, gates opened. When she disfavored them, contracts frayed. She was not a deity. She was a woman with fists folded in silk, and her decisions had the weight of law in certain rooms. Evan, who had felt too long the vulnerability of being owed, moved in a way that surprised even his advisors. He chose to make a gesture that could be read two ways, foolish or brave, sentimental or strategically brilliant. He offered in private and without show a contract that would change both of their lives on paper. It was a marriage offer, not immediately salacious but practical, a protective pairing under law, a bond that would protect her from ritual humiliation by making her his partner in the eyes of the city. Felicia's first reaction was confusion. The Wen name carried 1,000 obligations. To be bound to it was to inherit enemies as well as protection. She thought of freedom, the freedom to leave a marriage in youth, the freedom to walk away from a formal arrangement that would tie her to a man's history. She also thought of what it costs to survive alone in a city that loved to cut down those who failed to live by its rules. She refused at first, not out of an ambition to be spurned, but because she understood what she would be giving in exchange for a shield. Evan did not argue. He signed the legal drafts with a hand that had held 1,000,000 pens and the firmness of someone who understood obligations as architecture. For now, he said, in an earnest tone that was both mercantile and sentimental, a legal contract, to stop the spectacle. We can decide on the rest later. Felicia signed. It was the kind of practical marriage that cities have invented when vanity fuels ruin. Yet as she signed, her name a thin line on a heavy paper, something in her shifted. It was the beginning of an arrangement that could harden into something complicated or soften into something real. The papers were filed. The elites bristled, but their tools, their rituals, their letters became harder to use. A legal tie between the Wen name and the Gu woman made tribal humiliation risky. Roy gritted his teeth. Zeke narrowed his eyes. Mandy turned her smile brittle. But power, even when it wins a skirmish, does not win the war that fast. The shadow lengths on the city were longer than a contract. The scarlet of public opinion can reheat a stew that law is cooled.
And Lady Shadow, who had been watching, had not yet decided whether to bless the union with air that would make it unassailable. Felicia returned to the streets with an official paper in her pocket, but no map for the future. The city saw a new story,
delivery girl married to CEO, accent on the word married and not on the peculiar contract's small print. Conversations opened about motives, about whether gratitude could become devotion, if debt could be disguised as affection. Felicia, who had wanted nothing to do with spectacle, found herself at the center of it. Evan, in private, felt the old promise thrum like a guitar string. He had found her and he had protected her. That was not the same as love, and he knew it. Yet to protect someone at personal cost is often the first syllable of deeper language. He watched her move through the city, observed her stubborn gentleness, the way she set down her bag to help an elderly neighbor up the stairs, the way she refused to accept pity in any form that was unwelcome. The first wave of retaliation came as expected. Snubs at luncheons, a sudden crisis engineered to make Evan look soft, a whisper campaign about the contract. The Zhang family made a small market move, an outsized dump on a sector tied to Wynn Corporation shares, designed to create tremors and measure Evan's reaction. It was the beginning of a stock market chess match they believed their money could win. In the office that night, Evan watched the ticker roll like a scroll of judgment. He felt the hand of Lady Shadow hovering at the wings. He did not want to play markets like a weapon. He preferred leverage of a different kind, relationship, reputation, the slow accrual of trust. But the city was a place that sometimes replied to force with force. Felicia, meanwhile, was learning how to be protected publicly without losing the self that had made her brave. It was a balancing act, to accept shelter and still keep her edges. She had, after all, stayed alive by being small and quick and honest. She was not naive. She knew that alliances could be a net or a cage. And so the pieces moved. Roy pushed harder. The Zhangs and the Shens sharpened their tongues. The city watched, primed to enjoy the spectacle of a possible humiliation. Lady Shadow kept her distance, measured and inscrutable, a pressure point whose attention could make or break them. Evan prepared buffers and counters. Felicia kept delivering dinners and carrying a lollipop that had become a talisman for two people's intertwined past. One small detail refused to leave the margins: the scar above her eyebrow, the lollipop wrapper, the memory of a hospital night. Those fragments were the hinge on which two lives would turn. The world tried to fit the fragments into neat boxes: hero, opportunist, patron, beggar. But life is rarely a neat narrative. It is a tangle of debts and gifts, of grudges and mercies.
When the next public blow came, it hit at ritual, a banquet arranged to humiliate, an offer misdeclared as generosity, a dowry displayed as a weapon. Felicia would stand at the center of that room and feel the weight of a city's judgment like a garment stitched too tight. But by then, Evan had learned to step into the gap between spectacle and truth. That did not mean the road ahead would be simple. It meant that both of them would have to choose, repeatedly, what protection meant and what love asked of them. Rain began to fall again, as if the sky wanted to rehearse the night of the crash. The city turned its wheels. Felicia packed her bag and tied the lollipop to its strap like a talisman. Evan watched from the glass of his office as the streets filled with umbrellas and small, determined lives. He thought about the boy in a hospital bed and the woman who had given blood and a lollipop and a foolish promise. He thought about the kind of man who would keep a vow, whether it was born of obligation or something larger. He thought, too, about how power could be stitched into mercy or folded into a weapon. And in the quiet before the next public storm, both of them, one with the ledger of a city and the other with the ledger of a street, prepared for the banquet where reputations would be weighed and a city's elite would show their hands. The rain that had been muttering all morning sharpened into a canned applause the day of the Shen engagement banquet. String lights warmed the courtyard like a false dawn. Guests arrived in glints of silk and glass. Plates were polished into blinding reflections of propriety. Cameras glided in practiced arcs, hungry for the moment when someone would be folded into shame and made into a lesson. Felicia tied the lollipop wrapper to her bag with the nervous ritual of someone who keeps small things to remember when the world tries to unmake them. She had learned how to walk through rooms that wanted to grind her down. Each step felt like a choice: sink or keep ankles flexed and move. Evan had insisted on an escort. He had insisted, too, that she come dressed in something that did not read as apology. She had chosen a dress that felt like a middle ground, neither armor nor surrender. It was hers. When they arrived, the air snapped, eyes tilted like blades. Mandy Shen's smile was the exact width of a knife.
Zeke Jiang's jaw was a calculating machine. Roy Chen moved easily through the crowd the way a man with lingering grievances moves through a room that smells of possibility. The banquet was a choreography of rank. Who would pour tea, who would rise, which branch of a family would receive which seat. It was a place made to constrain scandal into pretty places. Roy's plan was simple and mean: ritualize humiliation, a public kneeling, an ostentatious dowry, a pronouncement that would leave Felicia small and tasted like caution. Evan watched the procession from the head table as if keeping time with his heartbeat.
He had prepared for many things: lawyers and crisp folders, security to keep cameras from following too close. But he had not prepared for the particular violence of ritual. The way a room set on humiliation produced a shame heavier than anything a ledger could balance. When the elders finished their formalities, Roy rose with the theatricality of someone apologizing to a crowd while sharpening a verdict. He held up a scroll of paper, less document than performance, and read with a voice that folded over its listeners, a litany of slights. He framed it as concern for public order, then allowed his language to stiffen into accusation. "You claim to have saved a life," he said, eyes on Felicia. "Yet we have reason to ask, what are your intentions now? Are you using sentiment to climb?" He let the question hang like a bird plucked from the air. The table rippled with murmurs. Mandy leaned forward like a woman peering through a veil. "A dowry is customary," she murmured, "a sign of propriety. If one receives protection from a wen, one must also prove one's worth, no?" A deliberate hush settled on Felicia, the way a weight settles on a portrait. A formal request was made, insult wrapped in civility, for Felicia to kneel and accept the dowry as a gesture of gratitude. In their world, bowing was a language of admission. Kneeling would be a public confessing of need, a spectacle shaped to the comfort of the comfortable. Felicia felt the ritual press against the soft underbelly of her ribs. The instinct in her, practiced and practical, was to resist. Kneeling meant cementing a story that would sit in the mouths of gossip for years. She did not want to be turned into an object lesson for etiquette. She stood. For a breath too long, the room waited. "Felicia," Evan said, and the syllable cut through. He rose from his seat with the precision of a man who had measured a dozen consequences and chosen this among them. The crowd exhaled into 1,000 little clicks, like a field of dry grass catching flame. Roy's smile flickered. "Protection is one thing," he countered, "but must we ignore customs?" Evan's hands were calm. He stepped forward and did something that no one present expected. He reached for Felicia's hand. The cameras tightened. Whispered questions rippled through the tables. An affront, a theatrically staged display of devotion, a strategic misstep by a powerful man courting scandal. Evan lowered himself, not into a posture of submission toward the elders, but in a way that reoriented the room. He took a careful, measured kneel before Felicia, not as supplication to them, but as a public refusal to let the ritual be weaponized. The movement flipped the convention inside out. If the banquet demanded humility from the accused, then the man who wielded the city's favor would instead make his respect visible. For a moment, the air stopped. The old men's expressions, polished into statues of orthodoxy, trembled like old string. Cameras leaned in for the angle designed to sell the narrative, a powerful CEO kneeling before the woman he had vowed to keep safe. Felicia felt the room shift under her, somewhere between dizzy and humiliating and strangely tender. She had never asked for a man's genuflection. She had never wanted a throne of pity. But here it was, and it read not of pity, but of choice. Evan had chosen to expose himself to social scorn rather than let her be scorned. Mandy's smile froze like wax. Roy's mouth tightened into the shape of a threat. Zeke's hand found the stem of his champagne glass, knuckles white. The elders looked at each other, measuring possible responses. Ceremony met a refusal, and the room squealed as if its outer binary had been hacked. "You're making a show," Roy barked, because when the powerful are unmoored, they shout to reclaim the floor. "This is theater. Is the Wen Corporation now a charity?" Evan's voice did not rise. It folded into a tone that had been born from nights of debt and gratitude. "This is a promise," he said. 3 years means something. The cameras fed the line into the city's belly.
Tabloid headlines rewrote themselves on the basis of that kneel. CEO repays blood debt. The phrase would sit in feeds for days. The banquet's intention to humiliate lost its edge. The ritual backfired, producing a spectacle the elite could not fully control. The banquet night was only the opening gambit. In the days that followed, the city's social nerves hummed. Roy pressed into other channels, a whisper campaign that suggested Felicia's ties to the Gu name were convenient and that her marriage contract was a stunt. A smear here, a rumor there. Zeke Jiang started moving his family's assets in ways that had the precise shape of a financial riposte, a sudden dump on shares connected to Wen Holdings, a short position taken with the kind of capital that could make a ripple feel like a tidal wave. Evan watched the ticker in his office as if it had become a pulse monitor. Lines of red made tracks across the board. The market amplified rumor into panic. Investors with shallow nerves churned. The Wen stock shuddered. "You'll let them play at that?" his CFO asked on the third night, window blinds of the office lowering like eyelids ready to sleep on a problem. Evan's eyes traced the negative slope with the same focus he had once applied to finding a needle in a hayfield of donors. "Not without showing the mechanism," he said. "They use their money like hammers. We will use their motion against them." The counter was not surgical in its technicality. It was a ballet of leverage, reputation, and public trust.
Evan called in favors, timed corporate partnerships, the release of a scheduled acquisition that demonstrated Wen's resilient cash flow, and a carefully framed public statement about long-term strategy that dampened panic. He used more than money. He used the optics of a corporation that kept steady promises. But the Jiangs had a speed and hunger built into their model, and their moves were not purely financial. They were personal. Zeke's dump was paired, as investigators would later show, with coordinated messages seeded through private PR channels, implying instability in Wen's leadership because of personal distractions. The intent was to make institutional investors jittery enough to pull support and force a deeper sell-off. Felicia, who usually navigated the city on a route determined by addresses, found herself moving through a different geography. Calls to witness statements, polite interviews where she would be asked whether her marriage contract was sincere, and tricky questions about how one accepts protection. She answered them with the same bluntness she used when verifying an order: short, precise, no embellishment. She had, in other words, become very good at not being owned by people's narratives. She also had a card she had not meant to use. Months earlier, when she had found an expensive wallet dropped at a crowded night market, she had returned it to a young woman who had been an assistant to a visiting executive. The assistant had insisted on a small thank you that Felicia had tried to refuse, then pressed something into her hand, a membership card, black as night, embossed with a symbol she didn't recognize. "Use it if you ever need a door," the woman said, the kind of odd, crisp sentence that suggested it was both a promise and a rule-twisting favor. Felicia had stashed the black card in a wallet compendium and mostly forgotten it. Now, when a barrage of insults and engineered market tremors made their way toward the one thing she feared most, being ground into a cautionary tale, she touched the card like a talisman and decided she would not be entirely defenseless. On paper, a supreme black card was meaningless to those who had not seen it. To certain corridors of power, however, it was a pass and a promise. It meant access to rooms where Lady Shadow's word mattered. It meant an ability to move a presence into a hall where reputation could be dissolved or recomposed. Felicia took out the card and called the number on the back with hands that sounded like someone who knew how to steady a breath. Lady Shadow's office was a suite of tidy darkness and a woman who wore authority like a second skin, her presence an economy of few gestures. "Mr. Wen tells me you're embroiled," she said, the curt syllable of her tone like a coin dropped on a marble floor. Felicia did not explain everything.
She said what she needed, that her life had been in danger of being used as a cudgel, that the Wen marriage, a temporary contract, had become a lightning rod, and that some people were using the market to make it dangerous. She did not ask for charity. She asked for recognition, a hand that could make the public ledger show a different entry. There is a kind of currency in being seen by power. Lady Shadow saw, and she made the first cold decision that signaled the change of war. "I liked the way he knelt," Lady Shadow said later into her phone, and the city felt the sentence fall like a forecast. "There is something about a man who honors a debt worth protecting. Send an invitation. Attend the Shadow banquet. Let me meet her." That afternoon, the rumors started. Lady Shadow had not yet decided whether to publicly endorse the Wen connection. When she did, it would be decisive. When she came forward to support a person, it was never wholly sentimental. It was a bartering of fortune for usefulness, of power deployed with a visible calculus. Still, for Felicia, it felt like a hand extended not because she was owed, but because someone in a room of power chose to use authority to shield her. The shadow banquet was not the same as a family's engagement party. It was less glitter and more weight. Invitations were like small legal instruments, rare, deliberate, and difficult to forge. The building they used for the shadow banquet had the feel of a place that had always known decisions would be made there. High windows that kept the city's light at a respectful distance, a central table carved from a slab of wood that had been a mountain, and a hush that folded like a second skin. Felicia accepted the invitation with an odd calm. She had a black card in a purse she had once thought was meaningless. She had a man who had knelt, and thus, against a room's expectation, decided to protect her. She had to walk into a room where names and reputations were minted, and she would do it with a card that said she belonged, at least for one night. At the banquet, Lady Shadow sat at the head like a woman aware of the right moment to blink. She wore simple clothes, nothing showy, but the room made a map of the deference she required. "There are people who make narratives into instruments," she said, turning to the table with an easy authority, "and there are people who keep promises." She let the sentence land in a way that set the tempo for the evening. She asked Felicia to tell the story of the night in the hospital, simple, human, and yet stripped of the posturing that had followed it around like a shadow. Felicia spoke in short sentences, avoiding flourish. When she reached the line about the lollipop and the promise, the room held. Even Zeke's boreatism shifted into surprised attention. The smallness of the detail, an orange candy, ridiculous and present, cut across the banquet's carefully built definitions of worth.
Lady Shadow listened, and when Felicia paused, she did something sharper than praise. She validated. "There are debts," she said, "that are not settled by money. There are favors that create more than obligation. They create truth." A murmur moved through the table. Lady Shadow's choice to endorse Felicia changed the script. She did not have to shout blessings from the rafters. She made a few small, precise moves. An announcement that the Shadow Consortium would be formally observing the Wen Felicia Alliance and placing a conditional statement of support for Wen Corporation's management, an announcement that, in markets, reads like a steady hand. The timing could not have been better. The Jiang maneuver, which had been intended to provoke panic, ran into a wall of confidence. Large institutional investors, sensitive to the weights of connection, held their lines. A whispered assurance from Lady Shadow altered the calculus of risk. Stocks that had slipped began to recenter. Zeke's short position turned from profit to precarious loss. But the victory was not only numerical. Lady Shadow chose also to issue a public counter-narrative, a measured speech about stability, patronage, and the maintenance of reputational honor. She spoke about the dangers of weaponizing personal vendettas in corporate maneuvers. She did not name the Jiang family directly. She did not need to. Everyone at the table read the subtext. The city, always thirsty for moral structure, took her sentence as a sentence of protection. In the hours after the announcement, social media reversed. Articles that had once sniffed for scandal now leaned into the narrative of loyalty and repayment. The tabloids recast the kneel from Evan as theatrical to Evan as steadfast. For Roy and Zeke, the air turned thin. Their maneuvers had not only failed, but rebounded into a picture of them as small men used by their own greed. There was a second part to Lady Shadow's protection that shifted the private equation into a legal reality. Lady Shadow's representatives brokered a formal dowry. The gesture that had been intended as humiliation was turned into a public statement of endorsement. The dowry was not a payment meant to buy silence. It was a public fund established with the explicit goal of supporting Felicia's endeavors, legal costs, a small trust for her family's arrears, and a foundation scholarship in the Gu family name. The act was performative, but it was also meaningful. It made the ritual into a net. At the moment the dowry was announced, the room recalibrated. Felicia watched the numbers be listed like talismans: a house fund, an educational trust for neighborhood children, a public gift in her name that made it impossible for elites to reduce her to a cautionary tale. The gift turned the weapon into a shield. Roy's posture curdled. In private, he spat that the shift was unfair. Publicly, his tone changed into the thin veneer of someone recalibrating his script.
The Jiangs smoothed their features. They would later write off the loss as a strategy misread. Felicia's response to the dowry was not an immediate acceptance of deference. She insisted on terms that kept her agency intact: board oversight for the trust, a clause that the funds be used for community projects in neighborhoods like hers. She did not take the money as a coronation. She took it as a tool. The market logic bent to Lady Shadow's weight. Regulators, drawn by the evidence of coordinated dumping tied to private messages that Evan's legal team had subpoenaed,
began to ask questions. The investigation into the Jiang movements revealed private communications that exposed motive, personal spite, instructions to seed panic, and attempts to tie the Wen family's governance to personal distraction. Where their plan had been to use the market as a cudgel of private revenge, it ended up being the instrument that showed their hand. Public opinion turned from curiosity to condemnation. That night, in a private room off the ballroom, Evan and Felicia sat with 2 cups of tea that tasted like a small piece. The city's hum had not stopped. Power and capital never sleep. But the center had stilled for a moment. "You did not have to accept all of this," Evan said. His voice was a rumble with a softer underlayer. "You didn't have to sign that first contract." Felicia chewed the rim of her lip like someone who had learned how to translate bits of reality into action. "You offered a shield," she said simply. "You didn't force me through it." He smiled, the kind of smile that had been practiced in private rooms where kindness was not always currency. "When you gave blood," he whispered, "I felt the world tilt toward me. I could not let that tilt leave me with a debt unpaid." She thought of the boy in the hospital bed, the lollipop's odd smallness against the vast wrong of life and death. "You found me," she said. "You kept your promise." He reached for her hand across the small table, their fingers fitting into a shape that no court could judge. "I will keep finding you," he said. Public vindication, however, did not end private complications. There were lingering resentments to address, brothers and sisters and families who felt slighted, reputations to repair, legalities to sign. Roy tried one more move, a PR campaign to paint the Wen marriage as a vanity stunt, to suggest that Felicia had traded personal loyalty for public gain. The story did not take. The public had already seen a man kneel. Public appetite for manufactured resentments dulled in the face of that image. Zeke, whose gamble had been both financial and social, had to answer to investors who saw a potential loss. Jiang Motors' stock wobble caused an internal family debate. Mandy Shen, who had pushed the ritual, found herself subject to social questions about whether the elite's appetite for spectacle had become cruelty. Evan did not simply rest on Lady Shadow's proclamation.
He used the moment to transform a fragile victory into structural protection. He reworked parts of the marriage contract into a longer-term partnership that included governance clauses protecting Felicia's autonomy. A public statement that any use of ritual humiliation against a partner in the Wen corporate orbit would be treated as corporate harassment. It was arcane in paperwork terms, but in social terms, it meant the elite's favorite tools were no longer as effective. Felicia insisted on participation. She sat in meetings and asked questions like someone who delivered orders and had learned how to read logistics. She wanted oversight of the social funds and a say in how the trust in her name would be run. She refused to be a trophy. That moment, when a delivery girl who had once been written off as a cautionary tale spoke with such practical force, shifted the dynamic further from a charitable rescue to a partnership of 2 people trying to build something together. The Shadow Banquet's ripples spread outward. Shen Tengnan, a celebrity and kingmaker who had been watching from the sidelines, used his platform to praise the choice to defend someone who had acted with courage. His voice nudged public opinion further, making the narrative less about scandal and more about an old-fashioned sense of moral accounting. Do what is right, even when it costs. As the weeks unfolded, the Jiang and Chen families found their maneuvers exposed to the public. The market losses stayed with the families like a stain. The elite's appetite for spectacle dimmed in the face of a public that had seen arrogance punished with public scrutiny and financial consequence. Victory, however, was not a neat line drawn under a ledger. Felicia had not only been protected, she had been changed by the attention. Attention was not neutral. She was sometimes reduced to a story about a lollipop in feed headlines. She was invited to charity dinners she did not know how to attend, seated in rooms where shoes cost more than her yearly income. She learned in uncomfortable gulps how to navigate corridors she had never intended to walk. Evan watched that alteration with an ache that was not entirely his. He had not wanted to make her life a showcase. He wanted to keep a promise. He had not expected the public glare to translate into private adjustments she would be forced to make. One late autumn afternoon, they went together to the courthouse to sign the final papers that changed the formal nature of their arrangement from contractual protection to a registered union. The registration was quiet. 2 witnesses, a clerk who signed forms with the practiced indifference of someone used to legal instruments. A small gold band slid onto a finger in a moment that vibrated with both ceremony and ordinariness. They did not make a show of the ceremony.
They took a single photograph at the clerk's desk. No glittering press spectacle, no banquet stage. just a snapshot of two people choosing to consolidate an arrangement that had, over months, deepened into something like partnership. After the papers were filed and the photograph clipped into an envelope, they walked out into a city that felt the same as it ever did, and yet in a private corridor something had shifted. Felicia kept her lollipop wrapper folded in her bag like a relic. She had altered more than public perception. She had altered herself. The world would remake small stories into legacies, but she had learned how to insist on the shape of her own name. Their private life was not a montage of glamour. It was a series of small negotiations, dinner choices, which one would visit which parent for holidays, how to talk about the past without making it a fetter. There were awkward moments, the occasional interview that leaned too far into sensationalism, friends who suddenly felt obliged to ask about change. They handled them with a quietness that felt like a new strategy, honesty rather than spin. At night, the two of them sat in a small living room that still had the traces of their separate lives. Evan kept a file of donors and hospital receipts folded somewhere in a drawer like a relic. Felicia kept a small basket with a new pair of gloves she would use to deliver when she wanted to move through neighborhoods that reminded her of the life she had lived. One evening, after the press had quieted for a day, Felicia pulled out the lollipop wrapper and smoothed it on the table between them. Evan watched the small square of plastic and paper as if it were a map. "Do you ever think about that night?" she asked. He did. He could still taste the antiseptic, still feel the quickness with which a hospital bed had become an axis of his life. "Every time I see one," he said. She laughed softly. The sound folded into a room that had learned how to be quiet around a city that rarely stopped making noise. "You were very proud of that promise," she said. "I'm proud of keeping promises," he answered. He reached across the table and took her hand. The gesture was small but precise. How he had loved her could be argued from many angles: gratitude, obligation, admiration. But in that simple clasp he offered something that had grown through time into care. They spoke in small sharps and slow sentences about the future. They spoke about the legal arrangements terms, about the trust funds and how they would be administered. They spoke about Felicia's plan to start a small delivery hub that would offer fair wages and opportunity for girls like her who needed a way to survive. They spoke about his plan to increase corporate transparency in the areas where private vendettas often found the money to become monstrous. The conversation was not dramatic.
It was instead the ordinary sort of building that love often gets mistaken for: compromise, graft, gentle corrections. She was not a Cinderella waiting for transformation. She was a woman who had worked through survival into a new shape. He was not only a man who had been saved, but one who had decided to answer the rescue with equal parts humility and action. Time, of course, rolls onward and offers new tests. Roy attempted a lawsuit based on manufactured claims, petty, mean, and legally flimsy, but it cost him more in reputation than it yielded. Zeke's family excised him from more public roles, preferring to bury mistakes rather than let them fester. Mandy found that social influence is a resource that withers if not tended to with substance. Felicia's family situation changed in a quieter, more complicated way. The Gu family resistances that had once closed their tablecloth to her began to loosen when the public gift in her name accounted for the old debts that had split them. Old grudges thaw slowly. Apologies are a project that must be performed in action, not words. In private meetings with her remaining kin, Felicia insisted on an arrangement that repaid the past but refused to be used as a symbol. She held them accountable to the same standards Lady Shadow and Evan had been asked to follow. The city, always hungry for a clean narrative, began to prefer the story of a man who kept a promise than that of a delivery girl who had used a station in life as a ladder. The truth was more complicated. Felicia had used a card she had been given once, Evan had used power in a way that could have been weaponized, Lady Shadow had chosen strategic support, and the elites had gambled with both money and honor, and lost. In the months that followed, Felicia launched her delivery hub. It was small at first, a few scooters, a storefront with a hand-painted sign, a promise that pay would be better and breaks would be real. Evan funded the startup as a partnership rather than a donation. He sat down at a table with her and asked what would be useful. The first delivery hub became 2. The program expanded to offer microloans for those who wanted to start a small business. The gesture shifted the narrative of the dowry from charity into seed funding. The public's appetite for spectacle cooled as the work of transformation required patience and genuine effort. Felicia did not become a celebrity in the sense tabloids desire. She became someone whose name, in certain neighborhoods, meant a line of opportunity. People came to pick up packages not because the company had sky-high marketing, but because it felt fair and honest. Evan's board adjusted to new governance clauses and oversight. Investors who had feared volatility found steadiness in the company's new plan. Lady Shadow's consortium gained a new kind of leverage, one that did not just buy outcomes but buy influence in the form of public goods.
Her choice to protect Felicia was, for her, an intelligible strategic move, a public demonstration that the wielders of power could be used to shield as well as to strike. There were, of course, quieter reckonings. Felicia would sometimes walk down a street and feel the memory of being measured in a single public instance. She would remember, too, the boy in the hospital bed and the small orange candy that once tethered two lives together. Those memories were not relics to be polished, but seams to be tended. Evan learned, in small ways, what it meant to love with attention rather than ownership. He learned to listen without offering protection as the only answer. He learned to accept that keeping promises is both an action and a restraint. One evening, not long after their registration, they went back to the place where Felicia had once given blood in a community drive, a modest health center that smelled the same of antiseptic and polite labor. They sat on a bench under a tree that had been a sapling when the crash happened. Felicia pulled the lollipop wrapper from her bag and smoothed it with a careful finger, not to make it a relic, but to hold it in the present. "You remember the promise?" she asked. Evan smiled, the way a man smiles who has been given a second chance at the precise practice of being human. "Every time I see one," he said again, the line that had once been an echo, now a small fact. She tucked the wrapper back into her back. "We made more promises," she said, "not all of them loud. Some are about how we treat the people who don't make the news." He reached over and took the lollipop wrapper, folded it carefully, and slipped it into his pocket. "I'll keep them," he said. He did not kneel. He did not need to. The kneel had been a public folding of honor. What he offered now was a daily practice. They walked back toward the city with the sound of traffic around them, a city that had tried to use ritual as a weapon and had been shown that power could be used differently. Felicia's delivery hub would continue to grow. Evan would continue to have enemies who test his lines. Lady Shadow would continue to make choices with the weight of consequence. But the pivot, the crash, the blood transfusion, the lollipop, the promise, had clamped two lives together in a way that had reconfigured more than reputation. It had altered how power could be operated. When the tabloid runs dried and the social feeds moved on to fresher shots, the quieter work remained. They made mistakes. They argued about choices that often required translation from one life's terms into another's. They showed up for neighborhood dinners and legal meetings and the tedious negotiations that keep good projects alive. They honored the past without letting it own the present.
On a crisp morning, months after the Shadow Banquet's announcement, they sat in their kitchen, small, ordinary, sunlight pooled on the table, and looked at the wrapper framed between them on a shelf. It was less a relic now and more a marker. It said that small acts can ripple into immense consequences, that people can be saved and then expected to be consensually loved, that power can be repurposed to protect rather than only to dominate. Evan reached for Felicia's hand, and she placed the lollipop wrapper in his palm. He turned it over, read the smudged orange stain, and laughed, a soft, almost ridiculous sound that felt like shared permission. "You won my heart," he said, "not as a decree, but as a tender fact. Not because of debt alone, but because I kept looking." She smiled, a quick, guarded smile that had softened into something without armor. "You found me," she said. They sat in the ordinary sunlight and let a city go on making its noise. The crash that had once broken them had, in time, bound them into a life that neither of them had expected, but both had chosen. Where humiliation had once threatened to flatten a woman into a cautionary tale, respect and protection had remade the story into one where small courage could force an entire room to reconsider what it valued. If viewers remember one thing, it would be this: a single night of danger, one scraped sedan, one transfused bag of blood, one orange lollipop, and a foolish promise set two people on a collision course with power. They chose to answer that accident with stubborn care. The city's elites attempted to weaponize ritual and markets to crush a woman they deemed inconvenient. Power answered unexpectedly with protection, public accountability, and a shift in who's allowed to define honor. Which moment shocked you the most? The kneel at the banquet, Lady Shadow's intervention, the market reversal, or Felicia's choice to take agency over the dowry? Who surprised you as an ally, and who revealed their true colors too late? Share which turn of events stayed with you.